How can rich people become so poor that they can no longer afford to buy food in just a few years? That's exactly what happened during the Great Depression. This crisis wasn't limited to the United States. It spread throughout the world and ultimately led to the outbreak of World War II. But what caused this depression? In this video, I will explain this crisis in simple terms, and by the end of the video, you will understand the lessons to be learned. In 1918, World War I ended, and all the fighting and destruction that took place during the war occurred only in Europe, given that the United States participated in the war but was very far from Europe. At that time, they did not have fighter planes capable of traveling long distances. So while European factories were being bombed, American factories were spared because they were not affected by the bombing. As most European factories were destroyed, European countries asked the United States to take over industrial production for European countries. The United States agreed to this request, but not for free. The United States then became a large factory that manufactured and sold everything Europe needed, and this situation continued even after the war ended. After the war ended, there were victorious countries, but as you know, even the victors suffer significant losses after a war. From 1921 to 1928, the United States experienced considerable economic growth. Many factories were built to meet the needs of Europe. Many jobs were created. All companies are fleeing Europe and seeking refuge in the United States, as it is the safest and most stable country, with economic growth reaching around 43%, which represents a high economic rate. The U.S. stock market then became the most powerful in the world, and U.S. banks the most important globally, to such an extent that the United States placed its money in European banks in order to support the European economy. By the end of 1928, Europe had completely recovered from the effects of World War I. Its factories had resumed operations, and European industry and agriculture had returned to a level higher than before the war. But one small problem remained. European products faced fierce competition from American products flooding their markets. Europe therefore decided to do without American products, which it no longer needed. Thus, whenever American goods arrived in European countries, they were refused if there were competing products in Europe. Upon hearing this, American traders panicked as they were beginning to lose the European market, which was the largest market at the time. The biggest problem concerned the goods that were returned to the United States, as the country was left with unsold stock. According to the law of supply and demand, when supply exceeds demand, prices fall, and this is what happened with the goods that were returned to the United States, where they were available in large quantities and demand was low. Their prices therefore fell, and the owners of the companies that owned these goods suffered very heavy losses, as they ended up selling their goods at below cost. Now let's talk about the Dow Jones Index in simple terms. The Dow Jones is an index that measures the performance of the 30 largest industrial companies in the United States. The idea is to track the performance of these companies. If their performance is strong and prosperous, the value of the index rises, and if their performance declines, its value falls. The value of the index is expressed in a number of points, and these points do not have fixed limits, but rather rise and fall according to the situation of the companies listed in it. For example, in 1929, the index reached 381 points, which was considered high at the time and reflected the strength of the American industrial sector. In 2008, it reached about 12,000 points, and at the time this video was recorded, the index stood at 49,500 points. In other words, as the activity of large industrial companies increased and their production and profits improved, the value of the index rose. The opposite is also true. When industrial activity declines or economic problems arise, the index falls. It is worth noting that in 1929, despite reaching a record high at the time, the index fell by 16 points in the same year. This figure may seem small, but at the time it represented a decline of nearly 4%, which was enough to raise concerns about the state of American industry and signal a slowdown or problems within large companies. In 1929, American industry declined by about 4%, and when news of this decline reached investors, concern spread among them because the companies in which they were investing were losing money, which meant that the price of the shares they had bought was falling. All investors then began to sell their shares, fearing that they would fall even further. In accordance with the law of supply and demand, the more these people sold their shares, the more their price fell. On October 29, 1929, the U.S. stock market recorded 19 million stock sales. That day was dubbed Black Tuesday, and that's when the Great Depression began, with the collapse of the Wall Street stock market. Since no one was buying stocks, it meant that companies couldn't find anyone to finance them, so they went bankrupt. The problem was that when the U.S. economy was booming between 1921 and 1928, it created a sense of greed among the American people. U.S. citizens took out loans from banks to buy shares, and when the price of those shares rose, they sold them, paid back their loans to the bank, and pocketed the interest. In 1929, after the stock market crash, borrowers were unable to repay their bank loans because the stocks they had purchased had fallen in value. And millions of people found themselves in this situation, leading to the collapse of many banks. At that time, when a bank went bankrupt, everyone who had deposited their money there lost their money. People began to fear for their money after hearing the news of the bank's bankruptcy, and they withdrew all their money from the banks, knowing that these banks were not in crisis. This movement led to the bankruptcy of these banks. After all American financial institutions collapsed following the stock market crash and the bankruptcy of the banks, the United States decided to take a very bold step. At the beginning of the video, we said that the American economy had become so strong that the United States had placed its money in European banks to support the European economy. The United States decided to withdraw all of this money to support the ruined American market. Then, the United States decided to impose tariffs on 20,000 European products, reaching up to 50%. As a result of these decisions, the Depression hit Europe, and since most countries in the world were under European occupation, the Depression affected the entire world. Most factories and businesses closed, and industry came to a halt. These closed factories employed nearly 15 million Americans, all of whom found themselves unemployed, as did millions of non-American citizens. The Great Depression lasted until 1939. Germany was one of the countries most affected by the recession. Its currency collapsed and the population sank into poverty and starvation. Hunger became something frightening that the German people could not understand. There was a citizen with a mustache who observed the changes taking place before him, then said, "The whole world is against us and must pay the price." According to many sources, without the Depression, the German people would not have elected him. After World War II, the United States resumed the same role they had played during World War I. European factories were destroyed by bombing, while the United States was untouched. Europe therefore begged the United States to take charge of its industry. The United States accepted this request, but this time on strict terms that allowed it to remain at the top of the world economy without any challenge.